Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. How do organizations align their AI ambitions with the reality of governance, compliance, and risk management? I'm Greg Rabine, and I help cybersecurity solution providers scale using AI-powered systems so they can grow revenue predictably. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Robert Wood, founder of Sidekick Security. So let me just run through the agenda, and then we'll let Robert introduce himself. So we'll start out with Robert introducing himself and telling us about his background, experience, and journey to the founder of Sidekick Security. And then we'll explore trends Robert is seeing in the industry, and then we'll talk about challenges or opportunities Robert is focused on, like AI. And then we'll wrap it up with Robert's thoughts on where things are headed. So it would be great to hear about your background and your experience. But Robert, you've led cybersecurity at the highest levels. You know, a four-time CISO with extensive experience spanning from Silicon Valley startups to one of the largest U.S. federal agencies. So I'd love to start by grounding our audience in what motivated you to bring that experience into a boutique advisory model.
Totally. Thanks, Greg. So I actually started my career in the consulting world. I started at a very, very, very boutique little consulting organization doing like forensics and pen testing and things of that nature, and had a great experience. I moved into a larger, more established but still pretty boutique firm called Cigital. For anyone who's been around the software security, application security scene, you will undoubtedly recognize that name. They've since been resold a few different times to a few different organizations, but I really started my career in the consulting world before getting into program building or running programs. And one of the things that I always really appreciated about working in those roles was the amount of tailoring that you can bring to every engagement with a customer. One of the things that really kind of grinds my gears, and this was true when I was in the CISO roles, was getting these heavily commoditized, like off the shelf kind of offering, even something as honestly commoditized as a pen test, having just it's just like I don't know if you have kids, but like you hear that like bucket of Legos just like dump out on the ground, and it's like just this generic sea of commoditized junk that is all just like there, and you're left trying to like put something together to make something happen. And I wanted to, in starting Sidekick, I really wanted to take this somewhat unique experience that I had working across tech startups and different sectors and the federal government, and bring that back into my world, my consulting experience, and try to bring together this team that can help program leaders, CISOs, CTOs, CIOs, folks who are responsible for running a security program, and really help them build a better program that is integrated, where the pieces of it that make it up are integrated smoothly with themselves, where it's really geared to serve the constituent stakeholders around the security program, where it's self-aware of its real purpose, not just stop the bad guys, or protect against the threats or whatever, and where it's really geared towards risk management and enablement. And I don't really see a lot of offerings out in the security marketplace that take those things into consideration because they're like boring business things, or they're taken for granted, or people are just too steeped in the security world and they're not thinking about all that other ancillary business organizational context that really does make a big difference. Because I mean, the truth is security executives are striving to get a seat at the table of the boards and the executive team and all of that, and they're trying to figure out how to best enable their organizations through the work that they do. And the reality is the tools that they're left with to do that from a vendor standpoint really just don't cut it in a lot of ways. And so they're left to do these like mental gymnastics of translation and filtering and contextualization. And so if we can show up and solve, or at least help solve that problem, I take that as a win.
Nice. Well, I think most of these organizations have good tools, right? You have good tools.
Mm-hmm.
You have good people. How do they work together? And how do they work under crisis? That's really what, So I think that, and now you have, I mean, the span of, small and medium-sized companies, and what are their choices or options? And then, you have, I'm going to say smaller enterprise customers that might have all these tools, and then, and I think what you're referring to in my mind is the platform versus point solutions. So.
Yeah. And so it's interesting you bring up the whole platform thing, because there's a lot of talk about that in the vendor space. And I think it gets conflated. So platform, like when you really think about what goes into a platform, it's not necessarily a technology platform, which is, it's really, it's a foundation upon which a foundation of shared services and process and sometimes technologies and whatnot all bundled together, but things can be deployed or sit on top of that platform. And there's a fantastic book, Platform Revolution. I forget who wrote it offhand, but it's a study of platform mechanics in many ways, and it's a fantastic read. I recommend it to a lot of people in these kind of forums or in conversation, and it breaks down a lot of the mechanics of like directed interactions between platform, like different types of platform consumers. And in the security space, when the term platform is used, that's usually it's kind of conflated with big vendors buying up small vendors and just folding them into their platform. It's like, we're going to unify your login to access all this stuff. And to me, that doesn't really, like, maybe that kind of addresses some of that platform definition, but it doesn't really hit home for me. And so I think it actually, to not to be a purist, but I'm going to be a purist for a second, but I think it means and can be so much more than that for the security leader who wants to think about a platform strategy in their organization. Like a simple example would be something like the security leadership working with IT leadership to roll out a centrally governed AWS environment. It's got policies in the form of kind of guardrails baked into it, like account policies at the, like service control policies at the master account level that flow down. You've got centralized login and stuff baked into it. You've got logging and telemetry support like already like natively baked in. And so developers, let's say they're given a set of tools, they can go build something and deploy it in this environment, and they automatically get all of these security properties and these operational resiliency properties just satisfied. Like that to me is more more in the spirit of platform than just a tool that consolidates a bunch of junk.
Well, I think it's the integration versus a truly integrated tool set, which is not so easy, versus bridging them together. And as you know, the biggest challenge or facing a CISO, one of the biggest challenges is, or a C-level person, is implementing the tools and having your team use them. And if they're not using them, boy, oh boy, that's that's the challenge for the vendor and the stakeholders, getting them in place, training people. So I guess being the thought is, if it's a platform, the same look and feel, that might actually be a little more straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's true. Like simplicity and managing complexity definitely matters. Like that is not, it's not a small thing. But at the same time, I just think it's important to not put all our eggs in that basket. Like there's just kind of general mechanics of how you like build coalitions with your peers and stuff like that contributes to how work gets done and how security properties can be infused with the things that people are building in organizations that go beyond security tools.
I mean, I think that the one thing out there, the big challenge is SMBs, from maybe 500 employees up to 200 employees. How do they approach cybersecurity? So when I say that, there is statistics out there that 50 something percent of S&Ps have no cybersecurity plan. And, they also, S&P, same amount, think that they're too small to be targeted, which is absolutely, wow, that's just crazy. So how does a CEO determine if he has the right solution? In other words, a 50 person company would have much different requirements than a 100 person company. So is it, a managed, MSSP? Is it somebody like you? Is it, an MSSP and a VCSO? How do they determine the best direction?
I think that I don't know that there's definitely not a one size fits all. 3 of the organizations that I worked at in a security program development capacity were smaller tech companies, venture backed, Series A through Series C. And under 500 people, and things are moving quickly. There's a lot going on. You're trying to get compliant to certain standards, your SOC 2, HIPAA, whatever it happens to be. And in those cases, those organizations hired me. And in some cases, people like me or people around me, people on a team. And that worked in those environments. We also work with smaller organizations, sometimes larger organizations that similarly have very little support, and they need somebody to help steer the ship. Sometimes engineering, it kind of depends on the company culture. Sometimes engineering can handle most, if not all, of this stuff, securing the apps, hardening the cloud environment, all that jazz. And really, you just need somebody to kind of help steer and direct and shepherd. Sometimes you need to offload more of that, and you might have vendor security questionnaires and more intensive client compliance prep and all of that. And in which case, it might make sense to bring somebody in full time. But if you're not quite there yet, if you're kind of in between, like that managed service model can also make a lot of sense. And I mean, MSSPs are also very there's a lot of variability there. Some are very much geared towards, it's kind of outsourced SOC. It's eyes on glass, 24/7, 365 operations, that sort of thing. And some are, the VCSO types. And even, you kind of like that breaks down even further. You've got VCSOs that are the good idea fairy, and then you've got VCSOs that are, actually getting in and doing stuff. And yeah, I think it's every organization's needs are different. For the CEOs that are trying to figure out what they like, let's say they're not doing anything and they need to do something, for them, I think it really comes down. I mean, they're probably pretty involved in their business development in some capacity, whether it's marketing, strategic, sales, things of that nature. And for those leaders, they're going to have, or at least they should be able to arrive at a place where they understand how often security is coming up in these conversations. And I think that's a pretty good indicator. If it's coming up a lot, meeting this compliance requirement, satisfying this particular audit milestone, having certain security controls in place and you have to kind of attest to them or fill out these questionnaires, all of that stuff. You should have, you have to go through architecture reviews. It varies depending on the industry. But if those things are coming up more and more often and it's kind of getting in the way of your growth, it's getting, it's putting deals at risk, things of that nature, then I think it's a pretty good sign that you need to do something. Now, you can kind of gauge how much something you need to do. That's a little bit of a gut check. Like how on top of it is engineering, or how much capacity does engineering have? Because it's not always about their capability. It's sometimes very much just about how much time do they have. Are they completely swamped and they just need extra resources? That's okay. Like that's not uncommon by any means. And I mean, sometimes you even see this where you might have a head of security and they're completely overwhelmed and you just need to offload, a chunk of things that are heavy interrupt work, low value in terms of like risk reduction or deal flow contributors, but they take up a lot of time and they're necessary. And it's like, just offload all that stuff so they can focus on high value activities. And so I think the biggest thing is like, how much capacity do you have and how much is this coming up in terms of what matters most to you? And in a lot of growing companies like SMBs, it probably means something relating to growth.
So when does tabletop exercises come into play? When are they? So you're talking about, maybe the unknown, how much staff you need, how much resources do you need to protect the business? So how does, tabletop or, using simulations and things like that come into, factor into this and your decision on the options that you're going to choose?
I really like tabletops. I think they are a supremely low cost way of learning a whole lot of stuff. But I think it's really easy to kind of phone it in and check the box and not really do it all that well or not invest in doing them properly. But I mean, if you get a group of people at your org together and, you don't need to outsource it. I mean, you can outsource it, of course. You can bring in a facilitator or somebody to design the exercise, report on it afterwards, whatever the case is. All of those things are totally viable options. But if you don't have the funds for that, or you don't think you're ready for it, there's this Twitter feed or X feed, I should say now, called Bad Things Daily that I used to turn to all the time. That was just a stream of disaster scenarios. Now, I mean, today with generative AI being what it is, I mean, you could just pump in some details into ChatGPT or Claude and get 10 scenarios that you could run with. And I mean, it doesn't have to be more complicated than sitting down for an hour and like talking through what if this happened and then think through the big five domain or the six domains of the CSF framework. How would we identify it? How would we protect against it? How would we detect if it happened? How would we respond if it happened? How would we recover from it? And, what does governance around this thing look like? And you kind of look at that arc, and just asking yourself those questions in relation to that thing, you're going to come up with interesting things like gaps in your logging, gaps in your asset management, gaps in preventative controls, missing recovery procedures, all this stuff. And that generates a backlog of stuff. And it's like, all right, that's a very simple, low cost, low barrier to entry way of starting to build a security backlog that's going to make you better.
It also, it also seems that you're going to need a skilled engineer or a technical person or even a leader to kind of lead you through that process and understand the results and then taking the action to correct what has been found.
I think that certainly helps. I don't think it's 100% necessary though. And the reason I think that is, security, at least in my experience, security professionals I think our industry has done itself a disservice in its attempt to prop up and separate how smart security people are and draw distance between how smart we are and how smart you need to be to understand security stuff and people who are not in that camp. And that does not mean, like, just because you don't understand security stuff that you're not wildly intelligent or capable, especially in the business world. I mean, because most executives are skilled in some way, shape, or form in the areas of risk management. It might not be the same kind of risk that you're talking about as a security pro, but risk management nonetheless. And so I think if you have a general framework for how to have that conversation, the tabletop conversation that is, and just take that like very simple sequence of questions that I posed earlier around the CSF, and you ask those questions in relation to a particular loss event or like disaster scenario, and you don't necessarily need a expert moderator, like a group of people who are used to working together, a technical co-founder and a business co-founder and head of sales and head of customer support, whatever. Like those folks come together in a room and they start asking and being honest with themselves about the answers to those questions, and you're going to come up with things. Even if they're not 100% exhaustive and complete in terms of all the things that you might want to uncover, it's going to be directionally useful, and that gets you somewhere. And I think it's a misnomer to think that just because, if you have a security pro there, then that means it's going to be exhaustive and complete. And so, it might be a little bit more so, but, yeah. And I say that not to dismiss or downplay the utility of having, teams like my own in these situations. Of course, we'd love to work with whoever needs such support, but it's not always the right time to bring in a third party, or some organizations just aren't ready for it. They just raised, or they're just not ready for it. And so, them being able to do something, I'd much rather see organizations be equipped to move the needle themselves in some way, shape, or form, than be hamstrung by, needing to wait for, the right third party partner to work with.
So, lots of topics within or areas within cybersecurity. We haven't touched on even security awareness training and the human factor. So typically, I mean, I guess in my mind, maybe it's not correct, that you would probably hire a third party to help you with that, training your employees. But is that based on the size of the organization or the expertise, or is that something that you can do without help, a third party?
Um,
Do it correctly.
yeah. Training is an interesting one because, that in my experience that exists on a big spectrum. You've got really high fidelity training that is engaging and memorable and educational and all the things. And then you've got training that is very much there to check a box. Some compliance framework says you have to do training, security awareness training, therefore we're going to do it. And I'm gonna relate this to something like security awareness training, kind of basic like phishing, best practices type of stuff. Now, I used to do a lot of red teaming, and every single organization that I've ever worked with has done security awareness training. And at the same time, most of the organizations that I've worked with, from a red team standpoint, we've been successful. And so, does that mean security awareness training is useful? No. Does it mean that it's effective? No. Does it mean that it's 100% effective? Yes, it definitely is not 100% effective.
Right.
And so I think the thing that I've kind of arrived at over time is there is a kind of like opportunistic nature of people just kind of functioning in their day to day in the workplace. I haven't checked my email in 2 hours, for example, as of like us recording this session. Now I could pop my inbox open after we wrap this, and if the top thing on my inbox has something that is like just super attention grabbing, oh my god, it happened to be at the top of my list, and it grabs my attention and shocks me into reading it and kind of flipping the script. Like that might be a much more effective pretext than if it didn't catch me at the top of my inbox, or it wasn't the end of the day, or whatever. And so there's a real, almost like conditionality associated with testing the effectiveness of security awareness training. And so what I've started to lean towards over time is an approach that is more focused on evaluating the kind of structure that supports people, or like the systems that support people. And what I mean by that is, take a threat, or like an attack scenario like phishing, and look at the various steps that it has to go through. There's open source intelligence gathering, OSINT. There's an email that's going to get crafted. There's domain spoofing and typo squatting. There's actually sending an email. There's, maybe it has an attachment. Maybe it has a illicit login page. Maybe it has, some kind of malicious content. There's all of these things, and there's controls that can be in place for every single one of those steps that an organization can invest in to make themselves just generally more resistant and resilient to any phishing attack at any point in time against any particular employee. Because like my security awareness training, or my security awareness levels, are going to be different than my next colleague and the next colleague and the next colleague. And so if we have this structure in place that is generally protecting everyone against the same types of attacks, then generally speaking, the whole organization improves as far as its security posture goes. If you're doing attachment scanning, and you have DKIM and DMARC and SPF records set up, and You have EDR deployed across the board. You've got all your critical apps enrolled in single sign-on and MFA turned on and managed device enforcement enabled and all of that stuff. Then it's going to be way harder, regardless of that opportunistic pretext, for a social engineer to achieve their goal. So I mean I've started to move. My mental model has moved much away from opportunistic red team style testing and more towards like structural assessment, especially, working at CMS, where I was at in the government. I mean, it's a massive organization. And so, you know, and it's very transient because of the contractor community. And, and so investing in security awareness training, I might, train somebody that they might not be there in a month. And so, they're kind of taking that with them, which, some would argue that's just a good thing to do. You're kind of training people and sending them out into the world anyways, so you should just do that. And I don't disagree with that, but it doesn't really do as much for your organization's security posture as I think we used to think, as a collective industry. And so bringing it back to, do you outsource that or insource it? I think it depends on what your goals are when it comes to training. If you're trying to just do security awareness training, I think there's some good, really funny, free stuff online that people have created and put out there. Tap into that, make it, don't sink your budget on that. And if you need to, let's say, get your developer secure, developing code securely, maybe, and that's a much bigger chunk of your company's, like how your company does business. Like maybe you sink your training dollars there and get a really engaging instructor or something, and and go that route.
Yeah, I mean, developers are an interesting breed, right? They're the kind of like the artists. So, I mean, even with the scanning technologies out there,
Mm-hmm.
it needs to be integrated to the CI/CD pipeline. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's scan early, test off, early and often, right?
Yep, totally.
So let's shift over to AI. So it's kind of interesting because everybody's using it, everybody wants to use it. So how and we're talking about maybe smaller enterprise accounts, small and medium-sized companies. I mean, there's different approaches. I guess one approach, everybody wants to use it, right? So jumping on the bandwagon. So and then some organizations, have a framework in place. Some don't. Some, don't allow anybody to don't allow their employees to bring anything in. You have. So I mean, and then there's shadow IT. I mean, people are going to bring in their own stuff and they're going to do what they need to do to get their job done. So how does, an SMB manage this? And a CEO, a founder of a company that has, 100 people is a lot of people. I mean, that's a pretty good organization.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then, we talked a little bit about the various approaches to managing security for 100 people. So now you got AI, great opportunity, but a big challenge.
Totally. Um, yeah, I mean, the AI adoption is it's in many ways it's really not new. It's the same stuff, that it when SaaS first really burst onto the scene, and people could sign up for SaaS tools left and right, and OAuth, this new hippy dippy tool that they wanted to use into their, sign in with Google, sign in with Microsoft, whatever, sign in with GitHub, and and your kind of risk exposure just starts to creep. It's in many ways the same core problem, but it's interesting because there's more than just there's more than just data loss, data exposure risks here with the AI adoption. Like people are building they're building process around some of these tools. The data exposure is potentially way more significant with respect to the kind of use cases that people are integrating or like using these tools for, and it's really quite gnarly. And so it's almost like SaaS on steroids in that time. But I think a lot of the core things that we did as an industry can apply here and help make the situation better. But I don't think that's necessarily exhaustive. Like you see all these like DLP proxy tools popping up, very similar to the early SaaS days. You had all these cloud native DLP tools coming online, and really hard to manage and administer from an enterprise standpoint. Expensive, difficult to tune, false positive ridden, and ultimately like not all that effective from an actual output standpoint. And so, yeah, it is a hard problem to really get your arms around, because and I think executives there's a lot of talk out there. The message is, if you're not adopting this stuff now, you're going to fall behind. And that's an unnerving, some of that might be hype and whatnot, of course, but it's for somebody who founded a company, or like the business owners or the investors, like it's an anxiety producing sentiment. And because it's like, once I'm behind, I'm not going to catch back up, and I might as well just like my business is sunk. And so I definitely see and appreciate and sympathize with that tension around, they want to enable and use the latest and greatest stuff and all of that and do it safely, but they don't want to get burned by it. And figuring out how to have those two realities coexist is not the easiest thing to do.
I understand. So I do remember the early days of cloud as a sales guy. You talk about your cloud-enabled app or product. First thing they ask, is it safe? We don't do that. We don't do cloud here. I'm aging myself, but yeah, I heard that all the time,
Oh, yeah.
all the time.
Yep. Well,
But
yeah.
so, I'd like to just touch on maybe the future of security. So, looking forward, just based on what we've been talking about, right? But do you think that a vCISO model and a productized playbook will converge into security as a service offering, where organizations can essentially subscribe to strategy, execution, and readiness all at once?
I think so. I think it already is in some ways. Like you have these kind of happening in different pockets, but take a platform like a Drata or Vanta. Their platforms like that are building all of these capabilities into their platforms, and it's at the center of it all is compliance and compliance readiness and assurance and whatnot. But there's a lot of good stuff that goes into that. Access control reviews, supplier, getting on top of your suppliers, managing your training, tracking changes, doing background check, all of that stuff. Like these are things that you want to idealistically be doing as a security leader anyways. It just happens to be happening in this trackable way in your platform, in your Drata or Vanta. And so that's really interesting. The vCISO market there's a number of these platforms popping up where the VCSOs have really almost like codified and created dashboards and wrappers around their playbooks for how they engage a customer. And that, of course, it's very well tuned towards scale and repeatability and all of that. The one thing I don't like about that is I think the answer, and this is just me philosophically, I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. And so like the way that we've approached this is we have a continuous security offering. And some chunk of that time, let's say you pay a fixed price and per month or on subscription, similar to a product pricing model, some chunk of that time is set aside to take you on a structured journey. Compliance readiness, basic resiliency, all that good stuff. And the rest of the time is geared towards a flexible, as needed, all the stuff that just is coming out of left field that the prescriptive codified approach can't necessarily predict and is not well suited to adapt to. So let me give you an example of that. Like, customers will buy a new tool. They bought a new CSPM and they rolled it out and it needs to, it's got 10,000 findings and, it's like at the risk of being shelfware, unless they tune it and they integrate it with other stuff that's, existing in the org. Like they have to make sure that it is deployed properly. And so that's ad hoc, unplanned work or like work that doesn't fall into the prescriptive bucket that you just need security engineers to jump in and do. And so having time set aside to kind of support your structured journey and then your unstructured, unplanned stuff is where we sit. And so and I think that's like the most pure way of almost like boiling down my experience in security with like, yes, you have your plans, but like that Mike Tyson quote, like you're going to get punched in the mouth and then everything's going to change and you're going to have to adapt. Like you're going to have, a supplier is going to get breached. There's going to be a crazy 0 day you have to respond to. Major vendor, enterprise vendor comes through the front door and you have to like drop everything and try to help get that over the finish line. Whatever it is, like if you're so stuck on either, if you have no plan, that's going to be a disaster. If you're overly stuck on your plan, that's also going to be a disaster because all these other fires are going to eventually consume you. And so you have to be able to deal with both.
Yeah, I think that word is such a great word, continuous. There can't be any lapse. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
Just can't.
Because stuff is always happening. And, things are always changing and like there are best practices and there is a journey that you can go on, but it can't all be that because, even if it was hyper personalized down to every customer, and let's say we build a 12-month roadmap for everyone based on an initial maturity review and whatnot. Even if you do that, things are going to change 8 months in, and you have to be able to adapt at that point in time. But the reality is things are actually changing on a much more like tactical basis, day in, day out, week in, week out. And you have to, you got to be able to move the big rocks and put out the small fires.
So, it doesn't seem like there's any simple answer here. Never is, right? So, obviously, we didn't touch too much on cyber insurance. But do you think, I wanted to ask you your thoughts on where you see cybersecurity programs evolving over the next 3-5 years, certainly, especially in the healthcare and fintech. But I guess one more direct question: do you think, based on what we talked about, do you think that the government will make cyber insurance mandatory, similar to health insurance? In other words, everybody has to have insurance.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I don't know, to be honest. Part of me would love to say I hope that's the case. But I'll admit, maybe I shouldn't be saying this on a podcast, but I am I'm not the biggest fan of insurance, just generally speaking. I like almost every time that I've had to deal with insurance on some personal level, it's almost always a disaster and it feels
Yeah,
like a racket.
I agree.
And but at the same time, I will say, I my wife and I were just selling a home, and we were a week away from closing, and there was a pipe burst in the house and destroyed most of the house,
Oh my God.
and home insurance came through, and it was amazing. And it was, it and so like I can't actually like I while I've had these really rough experiences, I've also had really wonderful experiences. And I know that, like I wasn't going to float 120K out of pocket, to like fix up this house. Like that would have been bananas. But yeah, but insurance was there. And it did exactly what it was supposed to do and exactly the time it was supposed to do it. And so I think one of the things that is tricky in I think some of these conditions exist in other forms of insurance, car insurance, health insurance, is you could get insurance on a business, cyber liability insurance. So, well, it's super cost prohibitive right now. It's super expensive, and that's problematic in and of itself. From compare it to like insurance or professional liability insurance. It's like it's insanely expensive, and 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 there's a lot of stuff that you control, and there's a lot of stuff that you don't control in terms of your susceptibility to being breached and or your resiliency once you've been breached to like minimize and contain and control. And there's it's I don't know that we've arrived at a place of having like good solid agreement on the core controls or the framework that we need to measure against or like all of those things. Then there's just so much like variability in organizations writ large that that would be hard. But at the same time, I totally could see the merit of it. But I think if we did it, it would, there's also the cost element of it, like, forcing businesses to, pay for a business our size. Like if we wanted to go get $5 million in cyber liability insurance, that would probably cost us like 10 times or more what the rest of our insurance costs, like collectively. And that's bananas to me. And we're not even a complicated company in terms of, we don't have a bunch of like personal data and all of that stuff. So, for a complicated company, I could only imagine how that would just explode and put pressure on businesses. And it's like, who wins in that end game?
Well, the insurance companies, I mean, I've been reading how, and I work with a lot of them, but the underwriters, but how they have their own internal cybersecurity staff and infrastructure. So if you make a claim, which I do with my children, right, and that's always so it was kind of interesting what you said before. But when you get it approved, you're shocked. You're thank
Right,
God,
right.
It's like their job is not to approve, right, or to pay. So it's a little bit of a challenge, and yeah, I mean, yeah, interesting. What your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean the insurance thing is super interesting because I mean it is a I mean it's a thing these days. It's it's as it's like car insurance. It's flood insurance, whatever. It's a loss kind of scenario, a risk scenario that needs to be accounted for. Absolutely. It's just it I don't think we've and I don't know why it's necessarily so expensive relative to I mean, I'm just not an insurance expert.
Yeah, me
It's
either.
probably very simple and explainable to other people, but I don't know if it's because we don't have the, like the market penetration of of so many organizations using this like insurance product, therefore driving the price down and kind of, being able to like normalize these big, portfolios of risk that the insurance companies are carrying. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's because, well, I honestly don't know, but I think that has to play a part in it.
Well, you have to add one more participant in that conversation, right? The insurance company, the stakeholders who are have a claim, and then the lawyers.
And then the lawyers, yeah, of course, the lawyers. And that, yeah, and the lawyers probably not as heavily involved in some of these other insurance situations that are a
Right.
little
Exactly.
straightforward, or
Well,
yeah,
they're big. Yeah, it's big bucks.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
So as we finish up here, and it's been really a great conversation, and we talked about briefly, but the future of cyber. So where do you think, where do you think this is headed in the next 3 to 5 years? I suggested, the security as a service, but what is your sense or your opinion on where things are heading?
I do think that that's going to play a part in it. I 100% do. I think I think it's natural for AI to also play a big part in that. Kind of security as a service, augmented by, supported by AI in some way, shape, or form. I think that that's going to play a big part. My hope, though, bringing us back to the whole platform conversation, is that across the board, we start to invest in more platform mechanics as an industry, and us as an industry in relation to our peer fields and disciplines and business units and such with whom we're working. And I think when we do that, there's economies of scale and reproducibility that we can tap into that are just going to make things better and more data driven and just all of that than this, everyone's a special snowflake and we're trying to reproduce everything on our own. Like everything can't be a copy paste of the next org, but there's so much that we can reproduce and share and co-opt. And I want to see more of that platformization in the true sense of it. And with time and space left over for the necessary customization and tailoring that exists in any organization.
Understand. Well, I guess as we finish up here, so how can people find you?
So people could find me online posting something snarky on LinkedIn, most likely. So our website is at sidekicksecurity.io. You can hit me up there. Hello at sidekicksecurity.io. And yeah, you can follow us on LinkedIn, follow me on LinkedIn, engage with me there. I'm pretty active when it comes to responding to people, engaging directly, all of that. But we'd love to have a conversation. And if you fall into that SMB need and you're trying to figure out what in the world to do, that is a core demographic that we have signed up to serve. So
Awesome. Well, Robert, thank you so much for the robust, dynamic conversation. I really enjoyed it and really enjoyed hearing your perspective on all of these topics. And I wanted to thank you very much.
thank you, sir. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks.